Hi, today we're going to talk about Gestalt theory and principles. I guess to start off with, Gestalt theory comes from the field of psychology. It was developed by a group of German psychologists in the 1920s. And it is a theory that's focused on how humans process visual stimulus in the brain. Gestalt theory is sometimes known as the law of simplicity. Simplicity is sort of an important term in sort of thinking about the essence of Gestalt and what it means. Gestalt as a word it doesn't directly translate into English from the German, but it can be loosely translated as unified whole, WHOLE. So this idea of unity, simplicity, the whole is really critical. Let's see. So in a nutshell, right, Gestalt is this idea that all visual stimulus is perceived by our brains in the simplest of terms. Okay, everything's going to be reduced down so that we can quickly understand it. I think this is sort of a very useful survival mechanism, and that is why it's so powerful. Our brains seek to pare down and to organize visual information into the simplest forms, right? When we see it again, so we can process quickly, understand quickly, and choose an appropriate reaction, right? So in Gestalt, the whole is what is so important and not first the parts, okay? Gestalt, sort of this basic principle, the essence of it is often mistranslated. You've heard this phrase before, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's actually really this is all about the whole being different than the sum of its parts or other than the sum of its parts. I think apparently this mistranslation caused a great deal of frustration and not dissatisfaction, I think, in the among the psychologists who developed the theory. So kind of interesting detail. Okay, so let's get on with looking at the some very fundamental important Gestalt principles. Oftentimes you will see more principles listed, right, if you are doing some research on Gestalt principles. But these are the important ones, and sometimes you'll see them named slightly differently, but I feel like these names are pretty good in explaining and understanding sort of what they mean. So for our purposes, we're going to look at these six. So similarity, proximity, continuation, closure, figure ground, and prognons. Which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly, but that's, can be loosely translated into symmetry and order. The first principle we're looking at is similarity. So, right, this is this idea that our brains are grouping together objects that look similar, right? They look alike. Our brain sees that and we group them together, right? So let's see. So if we look at these two diagrams, right, the first one, right, within this black square, we actually sort of divide up this group of shapes. We see groups of circles and groups of triangles, right, because and we group all the circles together, right, because they're similar, and group all the triangles together because they're similar. Here, right, all the people that are you know, sort of described with black coloration are grouped as one, and then this different sort of yellow-orange sort of figure is sort of separated, right? So here we actually have two groups, and we're looking for the most similarity among them. This idea of having similarity and the tendency to group things based on similar visual characteristics also allows us to have something called anomaly, right? Where we throw in a difference, we throw in something that is different, and our brains immediately pick that up and focus on it, right? And again, this is the way the brain processes that visual information, and you can see how that could be useful in as a survival skill for humans. Okay, on to the next. Proximity. Our brains are grouping together objects that are close to one another. So proximity really indicating what sort of distance you have between more than one object. So here we have, we view this, right, when we look at all these dots here or these circles, we view these as three separate groups, right? And that's really because this idea of proximity is the dominant grouping factor, right? So the dominant influence, even though there's a color difference here, right? And we would think we might, that might be an influence. The proximity, the fact that these are close together, and then there's distance, and then this set is close together, and then there's distance, and this set is close together. That proximity, that close proximity causes us to look to, overlook that difference and see these again as these three distinct groups. Let's see, continuation, right? Again, these are all phenomenons that happen, every single day in probably most moments of the day in our own brains. So we are kind of familiar with them, even though we may not be familiar with the terminology. So continuation, right? This idea that our brains are going to group together objects that we see that kind of are spaced in a way where they suggest a line or imply a line or a curve, moving through space somewhere, right? Or on a surface somewhere. So here, right, we view this collection of dots, we tend to separate it into two things, right? We have this one curve, and then we have this straight vertical line. And again, this idea that for the curved line, that all these dots are placed sort of gradually stepping up as we move to the right. That's, the reason, again, with a little bit of space in between, that's the reason, this continuation principle, that we view those as all one implied line. And then again, we follow that sort of path or that location of all these dots, and they're going kind of all in the same direction, even though there's space in between. So we group those together, rather than seeing color as sort of the organizing force, right? That color difference. We don't look at this area here as a group and this area here as a group. We go across up that continued implied path and this continued implied path. Okay, so think about a dotted line. That's probably the best example, the easiest example. We view that as a continuous path. Closure, right, is a really interesting and exciting phenomenon, fun for people to use, designers to use. So our brains are actually kind of filling in missing information, right, when we are looking at objects on a surface, right? So here, right, as we look, we immediately see because of the positioning and the layout of all of these black blobby shapes, our brain is filling in sort of the outline, I guess, of this Dalmatian dog. And here we immediately view this as a sphere with these conical spikes coming out of its surface. And again, that's because of the spacing and the arrangement and the size, et cetera, of all of these triangular type shapes, right? We don't see them as just this random set of triangular shapes. We actually see sort of the white sphere, which actually isn't even there, right? It's not an actually, sort of asserted shape, really, which is kind of interesting. So this is called closure. Think about your brain closing in, right? Things that are left out, right? Or things that are missing. Our brain is kind of, again, closing up those edges. Here is another example, right? So this is from artist Judith Braun, who's a working contemporary artist. She works primarily in drawing modes right now, and these are just actually some recent drawings of hers that she's been doing during quarantine. And again, this principle of closure is really at work here. We sense that we have some kind of white, almost like a fan type shape here that's blocking, right, that's sitting over top of these concentric circle edges, right? So our brain is kind of telling us there's something in there, there's some other shape there, and that's that principle of closure. The same thing is happening here. Really, these are the shapes here, these black shapes. But our brains are kind of taking that information of how these shapes are placed together, and we're seeing these other, what we perceive to be these other solid objects, right? And again, that's that phenomenon of closure. Here we have just a little bit of a different version of this first one, where we see even more of that phenomenon of closure used. All right, a couple last ones. Figure ground, right? This perceptual grouping that allows us to know what is an object with a physical mass, otherwise known as a figure, right? So think of a rock or a person or a tree. And then what is ground, which is all the space that exists around a figure, right? Contrast, you have to have contrast, right? Big difference, or difference, right? Even if it's small, you can still see that figure-ground relationship, but you have to have contrast. Here, we have stable figure-ground relationship where it's very clear that this black square is the figure and the white is the space or the ground. There's no ambiguity there at all, right? Great clarity. This is important for people who design for large audiences and need them to understand important information quickly, right? Reversible, here we can see the black lines as figure while the white is existing as space or ground. Or we can flip it around and see the white as being the figure with the black as the ground, right? Ambiguous figure-ground relationship, our brain is flip-flopping continually, right? We can see both the black and the white as figure and the black and the white as ground all at the same time, right? Which is confusing, but exciting, okay? So that can be really a great thing to use for certain visual communication, but it can be a really horrible thing to use if you're trying to create immediate, clear understanding or dissemination of important information, very quickly to a huge audience that needs to understand exactly what's going on, right? Okay, so prognons is our last principle, and it's essentially sort of the fundamental principle of Gestalt, right? It's telling us that we favor things that are simple, that are clear, and that are ordered, and our brain is always kind of seeking to process visual information in terms that are simple, clear, and ordered so that we can understand as fast as possible, right? When we see complex shapes, look at this, right? This is a single shape, and but rather than looking at it as one single shape, so that we can understand it, we break it down into simple terms, right? We understand circle, we understand rectangle, we understand triangle, right? And that's what our brain is kind of telling us, rather than saying, what is this crazy outlined black shape, right? We tend not to view it that way in the beginning, okay? So that is sort of an example of prognons. And with that, we've sort of touched on all our principles, and yeah, and again, Gestalt is a really useful thing for visual artists, and again, it all comes out of this theory of psychology. So, okay, thank you.